and restart. Perfect. Okay. Thank you, and welcome to the Archaeology of the Roman Diet. I'm Fina. A little bit about my background. My primary focus of research is on Roman studies, but predominantly in the area of cooking and culinary arts and culinary sociology and anthropology. This is my favorite geek. I will geek about Roman stuff all day long, but if we can geek about Roman food, we can talk about this for weeks and I'd still be happy. So I tend to get a little excited about this. When I get excited, sometimes I talk a little too fast. Feel free to ask me to slow down. You are welcome to stop and ask me questions during the lecture. If I'm going to touch on that topic shortly, then I will say, that's a great question. We'll get to it in just a few minutes. Otherwise, if you're not comfortable asking questions out loud, you can also put the question in chat and my moderator will read out your questions for me as they feel it's appropriate. With that in mind, let's get started. So there's been this long-held belief that the average Roman citizen subsisted on a vegetarian diet of cereals, olive oil, and wine, while the more affluent dined on every extravagance you could possibly imagine. When you perform a Google search on the Roman diet, there is a vast array of search results, and careful reading will reveal to you that most people have this idea that the poorest Romans ate badly, or even like animals, while the rich dined lavishly on the best and most exotic of things. And many of these articles also claim that the vast majority of the Roman population lived in abject poverty. So where does this idea come from? Well, it seems mostly to be picked up from early 20th century historians. One such historian, Harold Johnston, stated in his Private Life of Romans that grain and grapes and olives furnished subsistence for all who did not live to eat. These gave the wine that maketh glad the heart of man, and oil to make his face to shine, and bread that strengthens man's heart. Of these three abundant products of the soil, the mass of the people of Italy lived of old as they live today. Johnston himself was relying on the works of earlier historians such as Joachim Marquardt and Ludwig Friedlander. The works of these historians paint a picture of the diet of the average Roman citizen of one of mere subsistence. It implies that they had barely enough nutrition to survive on, and depicts their lives as short and full of pain. Even some late 20th century and early 21st century historians have argued, like William Youngman, that the Roman life, we simply assumed we knew that life was brutish and short. And they take this idea from the concept that the average Roman only had this Mediterranean triad to exist on, right? Grapes, olives, grains, like Johnston was talking about in his book. But to contrast this, we have the writings of authors who lived contemporaneously during the time of the Roman Empire. Several works from the period shine a light on the agricultural activities that were taking place. Among these is Catos De Agricultura, the Naturalis Historia by Pliny the Elder, the De Re Rustica by Pliny's contemporary Columella. These three works serve as a primary textual evidence of the crops and livestock grown and available for the Roman table. So what do they reveal? This is the region of Campania in which Pompeii and Herculaneum are located. It was famed for its fertility. Pliny the Elder notes in his works that both olives and wine were produced heavily in the region. He further states that 4 varieties of grapes were grown on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, and he goes on to describe several other varieties of fruits grown in the region. Columella and Cato also describe the produce of the region, including cabbages and vegetables and varieties of nuts. From these men come some of the earliest known recipes. Cato's work is the earliest reference, dating from approximately 160 BCE, while Pliny the Elder and Columella are contemporaries of each other, both having lived during the 1st century CE. This also makes them a contemporary of Apicius, from whom most of the modern knowledge of Roman cooking originates. De Re Culinaria is attributed to Marcus Gavius Apicius. He was considered a famous Epicurean from the 1st century. Apicius is even mentioned in the works of Pliny. However, the recipes that form the De Re Coquinaria were not compiled into a single volume until sometime in the late 4th or early 5th century. And while the 500 recipes contained in there give us an idea of what the Roman diet might be like, many are derived from several sources, and only approximately 3/5 of them are believed to be Apicius's own work. It's on these works, Pliny, Cato, Columella, Apicius himself, that historians like Johnston base their belief that a diverse and varied diet belonged only to the very rich. However, to contrast that, we have the works of poets like Martial, Horace, and even Juvenal, who provide anecdotal evidence to a certain extent. But the food described in their poems forms what might be considered more middle-class diets. They describe meals that gourmets might have considered humble. For example, Martial details a meal that consists simply of lettuce, eggs, olive oil, smoked cheese, fish, and fowl. And this is in stark contrast to the lavish meals of the elite. For example, one feast served by Julius Caesar and described by Macrobius included more than 27 dishes. It was comprised of 7 varieties of shellfish, 5 types of birds, hares, deer, and wild boar, just to name a few things. Despite the simple words and descriptions, the literary works suggest that even people living a more middle-class lifestyle still had a real gastronomic tradition that existed all the time in the background. Their descriptions of dining focus more on locally available proteins, vegetables, and varieties of cheeses. The slide in front of you depicts just some of the food findings that have been found in Rome. We have 2 different types of grain, chickpeas, bread, figs, and of course an amphora full of wine. And while the food described in these poems appears to me more humble than upper-class meals, there's still a commitment to flavorful foods. This is evidenced by the detailed descriptions of sauces to be served with certain dishes. So is there something between the Mediterranean triad that early 20th century historians would have us believe was the diet of the Romans and the lavish diet of the elite? And this is a really good question, because the writings of the poets seem to suggest that to us, right? Not only do they show some differences from the elite diet, but they speak to a wider variety of diet for the Roman middle and lower class than scholars have historically held forth. The first clue that there is not a complete understanding of how the Roman diet worked can be found in this poetry that we've been discussing. Looking more deeply, it's clear that some assumptions have been made and perpetuated about the average Roman diet based on a small amount of evidence, which may or may not be wholly accurate. In order to correct these assumptions, different data are needed to be found that would open a window to the food and diet of this ancient society. I'm sure when we think of dining in Rome, this is the picture that would come to mind, right? Noble Romans laying in decadence on their couches while servants prance about bringing them dish after dish after dish. But is this an accurate description of the elites? And by focusing on the elite diet, are we losing some aspect of Roman culture that could educate us? The new excavations taking place at Pompeii and at Herculaneum have opened for us a perfect window of opportunity for fresh research. The tragedy of epic proportions that took place in these cities have opened windows on living communities. Generally, when we look at Roman stuff, we're looking at the trash and rubble that they leave behind, because we've built and built and built on top of Rome's foundations. But in Pompeii and Herculaneum, their location has preserved a perfect window of a living civilization instead of the remnants of a dead one. And this really has to do with the fact that they lie in the Campania region of Italy. They rest on the shores of the Bay of Naples, and towering over them is Mount Vesuvius. The residents of this region had long lived in the shadow of the mountain and farmed on the fertile landscape that surrounded it. But they had little idea that one day the mountain would drastically alter their lives and in the process create a time capsule of Roman life. So let's go back to this photo of the Vesuvius map that we were talking about before. As you can see from this map, there are a lot of towns in very close proximity to Vesuvius during the 1st century. And these towns were greatly affected by things that were going on in Vesuvius, although they themselves may not have been aware that that was the origin of their distress. An earthquake of large magnitude struck the region in 62 CE, causing significant damages to both Pompeii and Herculaneum. This area had typically been geologically active, and so earthquakes were no surprise. Many scientists, however, now speculate that that quake was just the beginning of Mount Vesuvius becoming active once again. Oblivious, the residents of the affected towns had no inkling that this earthquake was just a precursor of what was yet to come, because Vesuvius had not erupted in the living history of their ancestors. As a result, they were wholly unprepared for the eruption of the volcano that took place in 79 CE. History's best account of what occurred on that day comes from the eyewitness accounts of Gaius Plinius Caecilius Secundus, or Pliny the Younger, as he is more commonly known. In his letters to the historian Tacitus, he describes the violent eruption of the mountain. He goes into great detail, talking about the ash, the stone falling from the sky, the enormous cloud of volcanic debris, and even the choking, noxious fumes. He recounts the efforts of his uncle Pliny the Elder to rescue the endangered citizens before he died in the attempt. And what's clear from Pliny the Younger's account is the suddenness of the eruption and how utterly prepared the residents of the region were for such a catastrophe. This is not a contemporary painting, obviously. This was painted in the late 19th century, but it really gives you an idea of what that might have looked like, the mountain blowing up for the residents of the region. The people of Pompeii had no idea what to do when the sky turned black as night and the air filled with choking ash. Such a circumstance must have terrified them, evidenced by the flight from their homes. It's clear from the archaeological record that essentially one of two things happened. Either people abandoned everything they had and fled for their lives, or they died there. The eruption, we know, we speculate, we don't know, we don't have a time machine, obviously, but we speculate the eruption lasted less than 48 hours. Like, it was very fast, and it was violent and effusive, and I mean, we get a style of volcanic eruption title from this eruption. The Plinian eruption style is named after the 79 CE eruption of Mount Vesuvius.
Fina, this is moderator. Your PowerPoint presentation is not showing.
It's not. Okay. Let me see if I can. Stop the share and restart it. So like I said, some people abandoned everything they had and fled, or they died. We haven't fully excavated either of these two cities, so we don't fully know the death toll. While we do know that some people escaped, we don't know what percentage of that is. And we do know that there were survivors of the eruption, or people who escaped or simply weren't in the city, because we have evidence of family names from both Herculaneum and Pompeii that suddenly after the eruption begin appearing in other cities in Campania where those family names had never been before. Some people who chose to stay, to flee, also died in the aspect of fleeing, right? They started to collect some of their belongings, the eruption got worse, they started to flee, and they still didn't make it out in time. Failing to make their escape from the city, some people took shelter wherever they could, in gladiatorial barracks, in the interiors of homes, in the cellars of large buildings. And in the end, these places where they took shelter would become their final resting places. Ash and pyroclastic flows ultimately buried the town under more than 20 feet of volcanic material. And in the process, a wealth of material was preserved for later generations to examine. Did the screen change for you guys? Just want to make sure.
Yes.
Perfect. We've all heard the line location, location, location. It's true, and it's never been truer than in the circumstance of the Campania region. Location greatly affected how cities in this region were impacted by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. As you can see, there are 4 cities in red that were completely destroyed, but the ash and smoke cloud that accompanied the eruption spread far beyond the region of Campania and over the Laetare Mountains, affecting places as far away as Muccheria Alfertena, and obscuring vision and reducing visibility on the other side of the mountains. The impact of the eruption on Herculaneum was no less severe, but as you can see, it sits at the end of the eruption zone. Because of where it was in relation to Vesuvius, Herculaneum did not become impacted by the eruption as quickly as places like Atlantis, Pompeii, and Stabiae. It wasn't until later in the eruption cycle of Vesuvius that Herculaneum began to feel the effects, and this shows in the more staged evacuation process that we see in Herculaneum, indicating that the citizens here perhaps had a bit more time to flee. Indeed, when Pliny comes to help the people in the region of Campania, he's sailing from the other side of Herculaneum. We know from the records of Pliny the Younger that Pliny the Elder sailed past Herculaneum, Atlantis, past Pompeii, and made it to Stabiae. He could not put into port at Pompeii. And one thing I need to explain about the map is you see Pompeii here is much further away from the coast. That's because the coastline has shifted. Since the 79 CE eruption, Pompeii used to be much closer to the shore. And the map that I could find to put this on is not a 79 CE map of the Italian peninsula. I apologize, but Pompeii used to be much closer to the shore. If you go to Herculaneum today, where the boat sheds are, you will see that they are much further from the ocean than they were in 79 CE. Ultimately, though, Herculaneum citizens were forced to the same decision that Pompeian citizens were. They had to make decisions very quickly. During the first examinations of Herculaneum, few remains were found, and this led many to believe that many of the inhabitants had escaped to safety. This misconception lasted well into the modern era until remains were located near the ancient harbor, and it's based on the remains found on the beach and in the bow sheds that it's clear that many people fled toward the harbor in an effort to make their escape by sea. What's not clear is how many were successful. Due to the nature and violence of the eruption and the earthquakes that accompanied it, we don't know how many of the boats that made offshore actually made it to safety, because there is a possibility that due to things like tidal waves, they could have been overcome. They could have run into each other in the midst of the dark cloud that was created by Vesuvius and sunk each other. And not a lot of excavation, seafloor excavation has been done in this area to date to examine whether or not some people who made it offshore perished or made their escape successfully. While some may have escaped the fury of the volcano by the path of the sea, not all did, as the remains of more than 300 individuals were discovered there. Herculaneum, due to being in the path of the later stages of the eruption, was sealed in almost 3 times the quantity of volcanic material that Pompeii was. And it wasn't the same type of volcanic material, as the nature of the volcanic material that was erupted during the course of the eruption changed as time went on. The nature of the materials that covered Herculaneum created an environment of preservation that protected items like carbonized food, wooden objects, which have proved to be rare and significant finds for researchers. One recent find at Herculaneum graphically demonstrates just how violent the eruption of Mount Vesuvius was. In examining the remains of a skeleton found at the Collegium Augustalium, researchers found a hard, glassy substance coating the interior of the skull. This is the glassy substance here pictured for you. Chemical analysis of this substance revealed proteins and fatty acids in the substance that are consistent with human brain tissue. As a result of their analysis, researchers were able to determine that the glassy substance was the vitrified remains of human brain tissue. In other words, the enormous heat of the eruption melted the soft tissue of the brain, solidifying it into a glass-like substance upon cooling. The sudden and overwhelming eruption of Mount Vesuvius sealed these towns away, locking them in a time capsule. And in that moment, what was created was essentially a frozen day in the life. While some people got away, they did so with nothing more than the items they could carry as they ran. They didn't have a chance to pack up. They didn't have a chance to take all of their furniture or household goods. All they took was what they could throw together in an hour or two, perhaps in the case of Herculaneum, in the case of Pompeii, or 5 or 6 hours in the case of Herculaneum. And that was it. Everything else stayed there, including all kinds of household objects, stored goods, and other things like food still cooking in the ovens, and the contents of their latrines and cesspits. This photograph dates from some of the earliest modern excavations at the site of Herculaneum. The sites of Pompeii and Herculaneum were left largely undisturbed for many centuries. Herculaneum was originally discovered in the process of digging a well at the start of the 18th century, because if you've been to Italy today, you know that there is a modern town above the ancient city of Herculaneum. When Herculaneum was discovered in the process of digging this well, it began to nominally undergo excavations under the auspices of the King of Naples. But even these proved difficult due to the nature and depth of the material. It also appeared to focus, to be honest, on the material culture that could be retrieved and robbed from the ground to enrich the homes of the rich patrons funding the work. Excavations continued intermittently over the 18th and 19th centuries before being abandoned entirely. It would not be until the mid-20th century that excavations would resume, and these would be undertaken in a much more formal and scholarly manner than had previously been done. Pompeii's story of discovery is really not much different. It was discovered by an architect in the 16th century, but it wasn't until 200 years later that it began to be excavated again under the auspices of the King of Naples. And again, as you can see from this picture here, its material culture was either ignored, removed, or in the case of this particular hole, simply destroyed because diggers could go no further, and rather than look for another exit from the hallway they were in, they cut a hole in the wall to see what was on the other side. The excavations were often done by people with no knowledge or training, and they were not according to any formal plan. A valuable loss of research was a direct consequence of the removal of things like remains to designated bone houses without properly recording where the finds originated from. This is an all too common thing in the excavations of Pompeii and Herculaneum. In the earliest digs, when they found remains, they would just pick up the remains, put them in a basket, set a basket in an empty building. When they did this, the parts of the skeletons became disenfranchised from each other. And in some cases, the buildings that were uncovered were later reburied. Due to the smaller layer of volcanic debris, the excavations at Pompeii didn't suffer the same intermittent excavation process that Herculaneum did. Pompeii was excavated pretty consistently from its discovery and continued through the 19th century. It's during this time frame that excavations began to be more formal and started to follow a plan under the auspices of an archaeologist named Giuseppe Fiorelli, who put an end to the uncontrolled digging that had previously taken place. The current regio divisions of Pompeii and preservations of bodies through casting, like the one in this picture, are credited to Fiorelli and his formal planning. Despite all this, Pompeii did experience significant pauses in its excavations due to overwhelming world events. It was endangered both during World War II and World War I and World War II, and during those timeframes, excavation paused. And that leads us to modern excavations at Pompeii. As you can see, work is still being done in the city of Pompeii. It has never been fully excavated, and it may never be fully excavated. But now when we do excavations, we're taking pains to keep track of where things are, where they originated from, and to protect the things that we find, as evidenced by the buildings in this photo, in which preservation roofs have been placed over tops of very important finds. There's an unprecedented flow of information coming from the sites at Pompeii and Herculaneum that is shedding a new light on Roman life. Archaeologists at these sites are using new techniques and disciplines such as zooarchaeology, archaeobotany, environmental archaeology, LiDAR scanning, I'm gonna get the name of the room. They're using satellite geography, because I'm gonna get the name wrong and I'm just not gonna try, to map out the sites and to get some idea of where things might be located for future digging. And all of these new disciplines that they're using are providing us new information, not just about the layout of the city and its residents, but they're also providing us new information regarding the diet of ancient Romans based on samples of organic material and bones. And these finds are not coming just from soil samples, but they're coming from places like rubbish heaps and sewage systems, items previously overlooked or completely ignored by previous generations of archaeologists. This is one example of an area that they've previously ignored. This is the inside of a latrine shaft in Herculaneum. The early diggers were seemingly more interested with scavenging material culture, things like mosaics and objects and wall paintings. There's evidence of the removal of mosaics and murals from places like the House of the Vestals in Pompeii, and as a result, finds that spoke to less material things like food and diet were often not well documented or even overlooked entirely. They did make note of some finds related to the ancient diet, but only when significant quantities of particular food items were found. For example, we find notations sometimes of a dolium of grain, which is an enormous vessel for storage, or an amphora filled with fish bones. But often these finds weren't recorded in the context of their surroundings, which limits our understanding of who ate them. It's wonderful to tell us you found a dolium full of grain, but we can't link it back to its culture unless you tell us where that dolium was found. It's not until the modern era that researchers begin to specifically include environmental sampling and archaeobotanical analysis in their plans of excavation. This more in-depth focus on the foodstuffs of Pompeii and Herculaneum has led one researcher to compile a catalog of all the food items that have ever been found in the towns and surrounding areas. This is great. This is a step forward for our research, but it begins to shed a light on the food items found in the region, but it's only a jumping off place because, again, it doesn't provide context for where the items were found. And thus, we have no idea who would have consumed them. The continuing excavations at Pompeii and Herculaneum give researchers access to additional information and contextual data that paints a richer, more detailed picture of the Roman diet than ever before. Perhaps the most significant of these finds come from the Cardo 5 sewer in Herculaneum. This is which has to date the largest single deposit of food finds in the region. According to Andrew Wallace-Hadrill, director of the Herculaneum Conservation Project, more than 10 tons of material have been excavated from this location. This equates to some 775 containers, each containing at least 15 liters of material from the Cardo 5. What's unique about this find is what it is able to tell us about the diet of the people in different socioeconomic classes. There is an entire urban block situated above the Cardo 5 sewer, and here it is. This is known as the Insula Orientalis II. This block was comprised of shops on the ground floor with at least 3 floors of residential living spaces above it. Artifacts discovered in this complex seem to indicate that the shopkeepers lived on the ground floor in living spaces adjacent to their shops, while the upper level living spaces were occupied by wealthier, probably upper middle class citizens. All of these dwellings had latrines which drained into the Cardo 5. At first glance, it would be logical to assume that there would be an intermingling of the refuse from the different dwellings. In fact, when I first started digging into this information, I assumed it would be impossible for us to differentiate between the residents of one level from another. However, the way in which the Cardo 5 sewer drains led to a stratification of layers and quadrants. Here is a picture of one of the latrines from the Insula Orientalis II. And here is a diagram of the sewer itself. This stratification that comes about because of the way in which the Cardo 5 drains provides a way to differentiate the deposits and make some determination about which layers came from the lower class dwellings and which came from the more upper middle class dwellings. So what do the deposits reveal about what was being eaten by the residents of the Insula Orientalis II? Archaeologists have found that the block, which contained that refuse from the block contained, as they expected, a diet rich in grains, fruits, nuts, olive oil. Here's just some of the things that have been found. These are carbonized figs. This is charred barley. This one is actually from Pompeii, not Herculaneum. I apologize, my slide is out. My slides are out of order. Eggshells have been found. To be precise, though, the scientists noted that some 84 and 27 different mineralized and carbonized plant taxa, respectively, were discovered in the sewer. That's a lot of different types of plant material to be finding if you're expecting people to have a very non-nutritious diet. Although this is in keeping with what you might expect to find if early historians' assumptions about a largely vegetarian diet are to be believed. However, they also found, as pictured here, the remains of numerous eggshells, and the majority of these shells came from chicken eggs, indicating a high consumption of this item. They also discovered several fragments of goose shell. In addition to eggshells, however, they found small animal bones belonging to birds, sheep, and pig. More surprising, perhaps, were the discovery of more rare food items, including sea urchins. This is a modern picture, but they have found remains of sea urchins of this type in Herculaneum. And of course, the remains of dormice. This is a type of plump rodent that is considered to be a delicacy to Romans and often featured in festival eating. They also found evidence of exotic foods like dates and spices such as peppercorns and mint seeds. The sewer contents also demonstrated that they ate a diet rich in seafood. The researchers identified and studied an estimated 2,500 fish bones from the Cardo 5 sewers. And from these taxa, they were able to identify approximately 70 species of fish and 48 marine shellfish species. This speaks to a wide variety of marine species being available for consumption. If the assumptions of the early historians are accurate, there should be clear disparities in the strata for the lower class residents versus the strata for the upper middle class residents, right? The historical perspective would suggest low food diversity for the less wealthy residents and an absence of expensive food items. Instead, the evidence exhibits a great deal of similarity of foodstuffs from one strata to the other. In fact, many of the same food items, even expensive items such as black pepper, appear in the strata of both the lower class and upper middle class residents. This suggests that those who resided in the Insula Orientalis II ate largely the same diet, regardless of their socioeconomic standing. The only exception to this being evidenced by the slightly rare food items like goose eggshells appearing in the refuse of the wealthier inhabitants. So how does this compare with findings at Pompeii? Although there is no evidence of an equivalent of a Carto 5 in Pompeii, thanks to the workers of researchers with both the University of Cincinnati's Porta Stabii Archaeological Research Project and the Pompeii Pistrina Project, there's a significant variety of archaeobotanical finds. The excavations have uncovered at least 10 cesspits in the neighborhood of the Porta Stabii, which, while it is by no means as large as the Carto 5 discovery, researchers were able to remove several cubic meters of material for analysis from these cesspits. The properties in the Porta Stabii, like those in the Insula Orientalis II, showed by the archaeological finds within them that there were socioeconomic distinctions between the residents living there. And what these finds have demonstrated is that Pompeii had perhaps a larger variety of foodstuffs than Herculaneum, as supported by the discovery of this butchered giraffe leg. For the most part, however, the finds in Pompeii greatly resemble the evidence we find in Herculaneum and show to a great extent the same level of diversity. There is also a suggestion here that the wealthier residents had more access to slightly more rare food items like dormice and giraffes, but to a large extent, the same foodstuffs were eaten across socioeconomic strata. Things that included black pepper. So I'm hoping that the image is not reversed for you, but just in case it is, the smaller black pepper kernel is from a find in Pompeii. The larger one is a modern black pepper kernel. In this picture, it's almost impossible to tell without microscopic analysis that would destroy the sample whether an apple seed, whether the seed with the, that it does not narrow at the tip is an apple seed or a pear seed, because they look very similar on a visual examination. The one without a narrow tip at the top is a Pompeian seed. The other one is a modern seed. And again, the smaller seed is a dill seed found in Pompeii. The larger seed is a modern seed. This would seem to suggest that the two cities were much alike in their diet, and that the diet available to the residents of both was nutritionally more diverse than the subsistence diet that we have previously thought they consumed. Skeletal remains like these are another way in which we can examine the diet and health of the people of Pompeii and Herculaneum. By scrutinizing specific characteristics of bones, determinations can be made regarding the general health of the population, as bones contain the history of growth, of disease, and of trauma. Furthermore, by examining the bones at a deeper level through the use of carbon and nitrogen isotope analysis and trace mineral analysis, clues to the diets of the individuals can be obtained through their remains. Unfortunately for us, as we've talked about, Pompeii's data set has some complications. The initial excavations did much to compromise the data because there are inconsistencies in the recording, not only of where remains were found, but once remains were excavated, they were moved to bone houses for storage, like the one pictured here. Dr. Estelle Laser is one of several people, she is also in this picture, who is working towards analysis of the bones found in these bone houses. Because again, when the skeletons became disarticulated in the storage process, the bones of each individual became separated from each other. And this disarticulation of the remains means that it is difficult to identify the full skeletons of individuals. Nonetheless, people like Dr. Estelle Laser are trying to perform analysis on these bones. An example of the complications that can arise when bones become separated in the storage process has recently come to light because of the DNA analysis that has been conducted on a skull in the possession of the Museum of Naples that was thought to belong to Pliny the Elder. After the analysis, the researchers cannot say conclusively that is in fact Pliny's skull, though the skull does contain many markers that would be consistent with Pliny's characteristics. What they can say with great certainty, however, is that the jawbone that was being stored with the skull belongs to a completely different individual. By contrast, the data sample in Herculaneum is much more cohesive. Most of the skeletal remains here were discovered in the latter part of the 20th century, and when they were discovered, they were excavated and archived in a much more careful and deliberate fashion. Because of this, they were cataloged and preserved with an eye towards a more complete analysis. In just a moment, I need a drink of water. Several types of analysis have been conducted with regard to the skeletal remains. The first of these involves bone pathology. While the Pompeii dataset, analysis has largely focused on the individual bones that are most likely to yield the most information. These include things like pelvic bones, skulls, and teeth, long bones of both arms and legs. Unsurprisingly, the teeth indicate that there was a lack of oral hygiene, at least in comparison to what would be considered standard in modern societies. This apparent lack of hygiene could provide some indicators as to underlying health issues, such as systemic infection or other types of soft tissue pathologies. On the other hand, what they're finding in the bones is that there is a frequency of healed injuries that reflects a certain robusticity in the immune systems of the population. So there's record of trauma, but healing from the trauma in the bones. And it's further evidenced by certain pathologies of the bone that are indicative of osteophytic changes to the bones. So what does that mean? The changes that they're seeing in the bones demonstrate the presence of conditions like arthritis, that are much more consistent with the bones of people who have survived into later adulthood. So we're looking at these bones. We've been told the Romans have a horribly brutish short life, but instead what we're finding out is evidence of significant trauma that people have healed from. We're finding evidence that people exist into what we would consider old age, as evidenced by evidence of osteoarthritis appearing in the bones. Despite the difficulties of the Pompeii dataset, it's still possible, by comparing similar bone types in Pompeii to similar bone types in Herculaneum. The remains of more than 300 intact skeletons discovered at Herculaneum were subjected to a similar pathological analysis. What's more, because the skeletal remains at Herculaneum were studied while still intact, it's possible to draw inferences about the remains that are not possible with the remains at Pompeii. Based on the goods and apparel found with them, the Herculaneum remains represent a cross-section of different socioeconomic classes. The studies indicate that the population of Pompeii, while prone to some diseases, especially in early childhood, were largely a healthy population. And these findings are very similar to the findings of the studies at Pompeii. Largely a healthy population, ability to recover from illness and trauma, living long enough to develop conditions that we associate with aging. And it suggests and this is a leap, and scientists are, this is the kind of thing we do sometimes, it does suggest that despite the randomness of the sample of the remains from Pompeii, that the citizens of the Pompeii were also a largely healthy population. Pathological examination of the bones is not without its limitations, though. Any examination of just the physical changes of the bones cannot necessarily reveal diseases that affect things like soft tissue, muscles, tendons, nor do they fully tell us the nutritional consumption of the person to one that they once belonged. We can do a deeper analysis of the bones to find out more elemental information. In addition to pathological analysis, researchers in Pompeii have been able to conduct stable carbon and nitrogen isotope analysis of the skeletons using devices like the Keel 4 carbonate device. And this type of analysis can reveal much about the diets of an ancient people because there is a direct relationship between the type of food being consumed and the isotope signature of the element found in the bones. So what new knowledge do these studies impart? Isotope analysis reveals that the people of Pompeii ate a diet rich in diversity. The food that they ate consisted of a range of fruits and vegetables, grains, seafood, and meat of domesticated and wild animals. This data corroborates the archaeological finds of both the Carto 5 and the Porta Stabii. Additionally, it provides us some supplemental data by providing quantitative estimates of various food categories. This diagram is indicating the estimated nitrogen levels for the marine proteins, and it suggests that marine proteins comprised an average between 1/4 and 1/3 of the average Roman diet. Carbon levels indicate that the remainder of the diet was comprised of plants and herbivores, and that carbon testing, and while carbon testing is unable to distinguish between whether the food is eaten is just plants or is derived from plant-eating animals, the results show that there are some variations in the diet from what early historians would suggest. It also suggests that there is some variation between the male and the female diet, with males consuming slightly higher amounts of protein than females. Stable carbon and nitrogen analysis are still being processed for the skeletal remains of Herculaneum. The last time I checked, they had not yet published the results of the carbon and nitrogen analysis for Herculaneum. However, the remains at Herculaneum have already undergone and completed trace mineral analysis in order to detect other indicators of diet. The analysis examined the remains for traces of strontium, copper, and zinc, and the results of these found that the remains contained high levels of strontium and zinc. The levels of these minerals indicate that the residents across economic categories ate a diet high in marine fish, crustaceans, and legumes, but low in red meat. So, looking at the archaeological finds, the stable isotope analysis, the trace mineral evidence combined, the question begs to be asked, what does it truly reveal about our previous knowledge of the Roman diet? Well, for me, the answer is simple. I think that based on the evidence that we're seeing so far, that we have grossly underestimated the diet of the average Roman. They didn't sit at a table necessarily that looked like this, covered in fruits and vegetables and grains and nothing else. While antiquity has provided some answers through poems and other writings, it was just a jumping off point for us to look deeper. The overwhelming evidence to me indicates that the Roman population, including the lower classes, was much healthier and had greater access to wider varieties of food than originally thought. And it also indicates that the Roman population, including the lower classes, was much healthier than we previously thought. This indicates that they had access to and were eating a greater variety of foods than we thought. Additional revelations indicate that diet wasn't necessarily based on class. A recent discovery in, I think it was the Aplantis suburb of Pompeii, has located some additional 50 intact skeletal remains. And while full analysis of these remains is still underway, preliminary forensic investigations indicate that while most people ate meat and fish, at least one of the skeletons, who has tentatively been identified as a woman in her early 20s, led a largely vegetarian diet. This particular find is noteworthy even at this early stage of analysis due to the assumption that she was probably more well-to-do, and they concluded it that she was a member of the upper classes based on the quality of goods that were found in and about her person at the time of her death and the lack of evidence of hard work wear on her bones. This would seem to suggest that vegetarian diets were not related to poverty, but instead reflected the availability of choices in the Roman diet. What's also clear is that what food was available was not dictated solely by what was grown in the region. Modern archaeological excavations into the agricultural regions around Pompeii and Herculaneum indicate that there was at least some reliance on outside sources for certain commodities, as much of the fertile ground was given over to profitable export crops like grapes for wine and olives for olive oil. It's evident from the environment and fertility of the ground that cereals could be grown in the region, but of local cereals, not enough was produced to feed the local population. Additionally, records kept at the nearby Sulpici archive indicate that the region definitely relied on imports of pulses and grains from Egypt. It is also apparent from the appearance of dates, peppercorns, and other non-local spices and food goods that there was a thriving trade in foodstuffs from other parts of the empire and beyond. The work being done at Pompeii and Herculaneum begins to paint a different picture of the Roman diet than has ever been. It can be said that at least for the citizens of these two cities, their diet was more diverse and nutritional than originally believed. It is not the subsistence diet argued by Johnston, nor the extravagant banquet suggested by Apicius, but rather it's something in between. While it would be tempting to make assumptions about the rest of the Roman world based on what has been found in these two cities, that would be stretching the limits of our data currently. More examination is necessary before it can be definitively argued that the dietary diversity of Pompeii and Herculaneum applies to the rest of the Roman world. After all, in the context of the Roman Empire, Pompeii and Herculaneum, indeed even the region of Campania, form only a small part. There are, however, ongoing excavations throughout other areas of what's were the Roman Empire. For example, excavations at the port city of Ostia will add more to the changing understanding of the Central Empire and what foods were being imported and exported through its ports. And of course, similar questions must be asked about the provinces in Asia Minor and North Africa. Interestingly, archaeobotanical research being done in both the Netherlands and Britain is beginning to show that in both cases, Roman rule coincided with a much better and more varied diet than either before or after the period of Roman occupation. This, combined with the data from Herculaneum and Pompeii, give us reason to investigate the diet further and may suggest to us that other places within the Roman Empire may have been much healthier and had more varied diets than we historically thought, because these outlying provinces are also showing evidence of more healthy, varied diets. While it is too soon to make generalizations about the diet of the whole of the Roman world, this new knowledge is opening up other avenues and possibilities for research and expansion of our diet and our understanding of the Roman world. And I just talked an awful lot. Do you guys have questions? Questions, comments, anything you're dying to know?
Do you want me to record any questions? I'll stop.
I think if nobody has questions, we can stop the recording.